Tonight, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Zali Steggall, Independent MP for Warringah. Welcome, Zali, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'd also like to introduce Ed Coper, Communications Expert and Executive Director for the Centre of Impact Communications and Popularis, and the author of Facts and Other Lies, which is a fantastic title, Ed. Welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
Tonight, we're going to be talking about the intersection between lies, disinformation, and the threat it poses to our democracy. We'll talk about what disinformation really means, the role you can take in owning the narrative, and how active communities can effectively combat lies. It's a huge, robust topic, especially given the disinformation campaign currently being waged against the Voice referendum. And I know you'll all also want to hear about the new amendment that Zali is introducing to her Stop the Lies bill, which also relates to referendums. But first, I'm going to turn to Ed to demystify some of the terminology that we're going to be hearing around disinformation and to set the scene for some of the practical tips we're going to be sharing tonight. So, Ed, this topic is especially important to the community independence movement, given that we're a democracy movement, and one of the key pillars of the independence movement is the restoration of trust through transparency and the two-way compact between MPs and their communities. In a similar way, you describe information as a key artery in the pact, in our democratic pact. And to help us unpack that concept, can you start by telling us the difference between lies, misinformation, disinformation, and how it threatens democracy?
Thanks, Anyo, and hi, everyone. And it's wonderful to be here. I'm on Bidjigal land, just on about the last block of Wentworth. If I look down the hill, I can just see the border of Wentworth and Kingsford Smith, but I'm on the Wentworth side. So it's great to be talking to this group about disinformation and misinformation, because as we're going to talk about tonight, you'll see that exactly this type of group, the Community Independence Project, is really key to restoring health to our democracy for a number of reasons, not just getting people elected to Parliament, but also just by the sheer power of the network of ideas that you're forming and the truths that you're telling. Is absolutely fundamental. So, Anya, that's a really great place to start, is just a few definitions first, because as you know, as everyone knows, lying is not particularly new, and certainly lies in politics are definitely not new. Even though Zali is very commendably trying to pass some legislation to make it a little bit harder. So when we talk about misinformation and disinformation and fake news, these are all buzzwords that we hear so much at the moment. We're talking about something really specific, and it's the fact that democracy really rests on this fundamental idea that we have information in order to make informed decisions about issues around us and about people who represent us in Parliament as well. And so, you know, James Madison, who's president of the US at about 1800 or so, had a great quote. He said, "Popular government without popular information is a prelude to a tragedy or a farce, or maybe both." And what that means is if we lose popular information, the ability of people to get information and truthful information about the things that impact our lives, popular government is impossible. It won't be a truly representative democracy. And so that's what's at stake when we talk about misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is really, as a term, just means any information that's false or faulty. And sometimes there's really good reasons for that, right? Like satire can be misinformation, or you can a journalist might mistakenly publish something that's wrong, then issue a retraction. You know, there's sometimes very good reasons why information is wrong, but technically that's all misinformation. Disinformation is really what we want to talk about and worry about, because disinformation is false information that is spread deliberately in order to deceive you or to deceive a group or for some nefarious purpose, usually a political purpose, but quite often just, you know, like a cryptocurrency spam. It can be for making a quick buck as well. And the other kind of key thing to note about disinformation and how it relates to democracy and politics is that it's usually found in organised networks that are on a mission to spread their false narratives and to control the narrative around an issue with all sorts of tricks. And some of those tricks have become incredibly effective and easy on social media and on the internet, which I think we'll probably talk about later.
Yeah.
So it's become so important for us to all get our heads around what disinformation is, how it spreads, and what harms it's causing in society, and what we can all do to prevent it.
And I think just what might be helpful as well is maybe a couple of examples of that sort of misinformation, the harms that has caused the storming of the Capitol or Beetaloo Basin, and maybe Zali also might want to chime in as well about the climate denialism and the lies that come through that. Or Ed?
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Ed, and hi, everyone. It is really exciting. I'm here in Warringah. Unfortunately, our Indigenous name is contested, so a little bit more complicated here in Warringah, but still, it's an incredible year when it comes to constitutional recognition. But it is exciting to see so many people here for this, because let's remember, information and freedom of information is one of the most essential pillars of a liberal democracy. So democracy doesn't work if you don't have that freedom of information. And what's important in that is the fourth estate, the pillar of the press, of information, which I know is a contested area in Australia when it comes to our media ownership laws. But putting that to one side, information is an important ingredient to democracy. So the foundation on which people make their choices. And I always put my lawyer hat on when I think of this. So if you think of a court case where a judge has to determine between maybe differing versions of what might have happened, or look at analyze evidence, and has to ultimately make a determination of fact on the evidence to determine, the outcome of a case. Now, that is where disinformation is where it wouldn't be accepted by a judge as being a ruling of fact in that sense of it being true. There's a big difference when it comes to opinions. So you can have opinions, and that's where a lot of people that worry about legislation around lying in politics and advertising and all those kind of things, they conflate the two concepts between opinion and fact, a finding of fact in relation to a statement or a state of being or something. And so that's where, in relation to climate change, for example, where people start talking about belief, or they start talking about, whether they accept something or not, it's just, that's not a finding of fact. And that's where we need to differentiate that right of freedom of speech for opinions, but not in relation to actual facts. And that's where disinformation, like the storming of the Capitol building, where claims are made of stolen election without proper basis of fact to underpin that claim. Same, for example, Beetaloo Basin, or questions of there's lots around the voice. I think is the most pressing issue, because where we're talking about, is there a third chamber created by having constitutional recognition and an advisory body, the voice to Parliament? That has been clearly said by top constitutional lawyers. No, that does not happen. And so it would be disinformation for anyone to purvey that view that, as a statement of fact, that the voice would create a third chamber.
Absolutely. And you both mentioned news, and how people, I think one of the biggest topics which Ed raised earlier is how people actually consume news and facts now, which brings us to social media. At the Community Independence Project, we aim to get communities connected, to build tribes around shared values and in-person events like democracy walks. But one of the other ways that people connect and build their tribes, of course, is using social media. Ed, in your book, you say that our brains are hardwired to mistake mistake popularity for quality. And we all know that social media can be manipulated, but maybe you can provide a deeper dive into exactly how that happens and what is the algorithm.
Yeah, and look, there's a fascinating journey through the brain and how it works, which is really fundamental to understand just how dangerous social media can be and why we're so susceptible for misinformation. And to extend Zali's legal metaphor in the courtroom, the way our brain works, we think our brain is the judge, assessing both sides of the argument. But in fact, our brain is the trial lawyer. Our brain thinks something already and is trying to convince, ourselves of what we already think. And the simple truth is, which is very unfortunate for us, is there are so many more important things to our brains than whether something is true or false. It really doesn't rank very highly in terms of our hard wiring. The thing that is most important to our brains is our ability to fit in and get along with people. And so that's going to make it more likely that we will think like our peers rather than tell the truth. There's this famous experiment from back in the 1950s or so, where they showed a group of participants a series of lines, and one line is obviously longer than all the others. And they ask everyone to say which is the longest line. And the poor subject doesn't realize that everyone else in the room is in on the experiment, and they all say one of the shorter lines is longer. And what does that participant do? Of course, he says that the short line is longer because he wants to fit in with his peers, even though he knows that that's false and that the truth is something else. So we're really, we're in trouble from the beginning when it comes to filtering truth and falsehood. And then the other thing that we get here is we're getting our information now from a place that is wholly unsuitable to get it from, and that is social media. Social media is a really effective way of quantifying something that's important to our brains, and that is how many of our peers agree. There's a like button. You can count the number of likes on something, and our brains will subconsciously defer to that over the quality of the information that we're seeing. And so as you're scrolling through social media, something that looks like news is just as likely to be believed as something that is actually news. So we're just not very good lie detectors. And so the algorithm is basically what decides we're going to see when we open our phones or computers and start scrolling through social media. And it started from a very innocuous place, which was when these platforms like Facebook started getting so popular, there was just a volume of information on there. The platforms wanted to give you a good experience. It used to be called a timeline, as in you'd see everything chronologically. And I don't want to see all of my Facebook friends' chronological posts because I don't care what they had for breakfast, but I might care what Zali says about, the latest issue in Parliament. How am I going to see, filter that and find that? Well, the platform said, we're going to decide for you. We know a lot about you, a scary amount about you as a user on our platform. So we're going to choose what you're going to see. Now, it sounds great, but unfortunately, what the algorithm started doing was favoring things that we're going to respond to. And what do we respond to? Things that are emotive and trigger really strong reactions and emotional reactions rather than rational reactions. So yeah, that could be a good emotion like a cute kitten or a cute puppy picture. That's always going to get favored by the algorithm. But anger, fear, hate, division, inciting, divisions in society, those are things that also trigger our emotions as well. And so the algorithm started unconsciously favoring that kind of hate content, and disinformation almost always fits into that type of content. So over time, we found the quality of information we're getting on social media started to be really polluted with all of this really harmful information. But by the time everyone realized that, we'd stopped getting our news from legitimate sources, and we're just getting this overload of information that became really harmful. And so that's a massive part of the problem, that you get something we've always done, which is lie in politics, and then something which is new, which is a really effective platform to put it in front of everyone and have them believe it fairly unquestioningly.
And what
Ed, is this something
sorry.
similar to, sorry, I was going to ask, is this similar to unconscious bias? So we know in decision making, there is a self-reaffirming that occurs unless you really put in place processes and protocols to stop it. And so that self-reaffirming bias is reinforced by social media and what happens at the moment. And we don't have, you know, particular media. We have an issue around how many sources of media really provide factual information, where our journalism has gone to opinions rather than factual reporting. So is this similar to unconscious bias?
Absolutely. Our brains are supercomputers, but they want to be really efficient. And so we don't like doing hard mental work. And so that unconscious bias means that either we want to see information that already confirms those biases, or even worse, when we see information that contradicts it, we do these mental gymnastics to twist it to mean quite the opposite. And, you know, this is one of the, we said at the, we're going to talk in detail about, you know, the do's and don'ts, I think, here, but one of the reasons that the don'ts is surprises people, which is myth busting, is exactly that reason, because people might see some information that we think is correcting their bias, but in fact their brains are just very good at twisting it and, you know, fitting their existing worldview. So we will work overtime to not really do anything that's going to make us change our opinion or change our mind. So a healthy information diet is exposing ourselves to information that we don't already know and don't agree with, but is still factual and truthful. And that's just really hard. And people are time poor, and that's why we go on social media in our downtime. We're not looking to, you know, read a journal article. We're looking at seeing something engaging, and that's why it's so poorly suited to be able to get our political opinions from.
Absolutely. And we'll move on now to sort of some ways in which we can combat that disinformation. And one of the central pillars of the Community Independence Project and the Voices model is one of the solutions that you suggest in your book, Ed. It relies on the power of social capital, which is kind of the opposite to social media in a way, but you can use social media in the same way, but it's about those human connections and those intentional conversations. Can you share some practical solutions for everybody on the Zoom that they can take back their communities to combat disinformation?
Yeah, and look, it surprises some people say that some of the best things we can do is actually borrow from those networks of disinformation, because there's some things that they do which are actually really important for everyone else to do. And one of them is just built on social capital, right? One of the reasons that social media is really effective in terms of persuasion is that we can get information from our peers. And everyone knows, who's ever worked in advertising or marketing, that the best recommendation for a product is from your friends and family, not from, you know, someone that you don't know on TV or radio. And so social media allows us to do that. And that's the power of, you know, this community, is you're building peer networks that can then filter information out through them. And that's the most effective way to get the truth out there. Which is also very similar to how disinformation networks get falsehoods out there. They have something that I'm always talking about. It's called the intensity gap. So the intensity gap is where, you know, everyone in society, the vast majority might agree with something, but the people who are in the minority feel much more passionately about it, and they're a lot louder. We might be seeing this on the Voice campaign at the moment, for example, but one of the best examples is gun control in the US. By any survey, almost everyone in the US is in favor of gun control and universal background checks before people buy a gun. In fact, 90% of gun owners and 90% of Trump voters are in favor of universal background checks. Why don't we have universal background checks in the States? Because the 10% who are against it care so passionately about it and are so motivated to push their worldview on everyone else that they trump the 90%. That's the intensity gap. And we see this all the time with disinformation campaigns. People who are climate denialists or anti-vaccination or anti-lockdown, they appear much larger in society as a proportion of society than they are because of the intensity gap, because they are organised and on a mission to spread their truth, which is not true. Now, we can do the same thing on our side. We can organise with intensity and passion to spread our own worldviews, which I would add are true and based on truth and are based on things that are really important, like action on climate change and integrity and, you know, all the other issue platforms that we care about, or the Voice campaign as an example that's coming up. The people who are out there for the No campaign at the moment represent a very small proportion, not just of Australia at whole, but very small proportion of First Nations community and individuals as well. So that's a really important part. And maybe, Michelle, this might be a good point to bring up the slides, because everyone loves a list. So before we talk about what we should do, I think it's good to just reflect on some of the things that we should not do as well. So this is quite surprising, but what we've been talking about, the weird and wonderful ways our brains work, but what does work to debunk something and what doesn't? Well, unfortunately, facts don't work to correct falsehoods, and this is a big problem because that's normally what we think alone we need to do, is put out facts when someone is wrong. And by the same token, the same sorts of things that we normally do in response to misinformation, like myth busting or fact checking, correcting the record, these sorts of things are really not very effective. And it again just goes back to the fact that our brains aren't really looking for whether something is true or not. Our brains are looking for defending our existing view, and we become hostile to facts or myth busting or fact checking that contradicts something we already know. So at best, it's not ineffective. At worst, it might even be counterproductive because our brains become so hostile, it might push us back into the myth that we're trying to debunk. Another thing that doesn't work, and you see this all the time, is negating the falsehood. And this is, I fall into this trap all the time. Everyone does, especially when there's an accusation leveled at you. You are something, you come back and say, I am not something. That's negating something. So I've got an example here on The Voice, and that Zali's already mentioned, when there's a lot of misinformation saying it's going to create a third chamber. But if you come out and say a voice is not a third chamber, all we are doing is reinforcing the other side's frame. And our brains, again, we're very good at remembering the substance of that sentence, but not the negation. Now, anyone with kids will realize this. When you tell them don't do something, they just hear what you don't want them to do, and they don't hear the don't bit, right? Yeah. So that doesn't change when we get older either. So we can't just negate the accusation. The other thing that doesn't work is bringing attention to it in order to debunk it. And I think a good example that we experienced in 2019 in Australia was with the death tax disinformation campaign against Labor in the 2019 election. And their response was to try to get the media to talk as much about all this disinformation campaign and tell everyone who hadn't already heard about it that they do not have a death tax. Of course, a lot of people were exposed to that disinformation through those efforts to bring attention to it. So this is a long-held communications concept about not bringing attention or giving oxygen to things that we don't want people to see.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really ineffective is leaving a vacuum. So one of the other wonderful things about our brain is the fact that whatever information gets to it first will take up residence and be really hard to dislodge. And so when there is an important issue out there, or an issue that we feel might be prone to misinformation, by saying nothing on it, that also helps the misinformation spread. And responding to misinformation is always going to be a lot harder than getting out in front of it. Right, I might go to the next one there. So that's all the bad news. What's the good news? What are the things that do work? What can we do? As I mentioned there, getting to someone's brain first. So this is, it sometimes runs counter to to how we need to do things in reality. Sometimes we don't know what we're going to have to debunk, and there might be some completely crazy thing out there, and you have to face some conspiracy theory or something that you could never predict. But more often than not, it's about topics that are really important that we know are going to come down the pipeline. So, the same old things around climate change we know is an issue that is always going to be prone to media hysteria, right-wing commentators hysteria, social media hysteria, organised disinformation campaigns funded by fossil fuel interests. These sorts of things, we know that we can predict the sorts of things that people are going to say. The best thing to do is to get out there with our factual information first. So a great example of this in the US election in 2020, they knew there was going to be a lot of election misinformation out there about early voting and mail-in voting. So a lot of people had really good campaigns to get out there and say the mail-in system is safe. You can trust it. Here's how it works. Here's the, all the features, and give a lot of detail about it. And so if someone had heard that, then when they see disinformation about the mail-in system, it bumps up against something they've already perceived in their head. And they say, hang on a minute, I know that's not true. I know what the true story is here. So fundamentally important to get out ahead of the misinformation, by far and away the most effective thing you can do. Unfortunately, we won't always have that advantage. The other thing that's really good to do is to get out there and warn people, not just about the specific topic, but about misinformation and disinformation in general. So this is a form of inoculation, and it works like any vaccine, where if you can expose people to the idea of disinformation and how it works, they build protective mental antibodies and are less likely to respond to it when they see it. And in fact, there's all these studies have been done. They taught a group of people about big tobacco disinformation when it denied the link between smoking and cancer. And then subsequently showed those people who they'd explained the big tobacco disinformation to, they showed them a bunch of climate change disinformation. And the people who'd learned about big tobacco could recognize at a much higher rate what the climate change misinformation was doing, because they recognized the tactics and they had been inoculated about it. So we can just talk about misinformation in general. The third thing is really important, as instead of negating, like I mentioned before, what is the positive alternative? The mail-in ballot system is safe. That's the best message to get out there. Say what something is. What will the voice do, rather than saying what it won't do? And linked to that, the next point is have a more compelling story. So not just what we say, but how we say it. The other feature of our brains is that we love a good yarn, and conspiracy theories, disinformation is always wrapped up in stories about lizard people and aliens and, all these wonderfully entertaining things. And then we think that our, peer-reviewed journal articles are going to compete against that. Well, they won't. We need to put our truth into a compelling story. We need to talk about our values and positively and compellingly. Now, the other thing which is really great is one-on-one conversations, and that's what a group like this is really well suited to do, where you can go away in your own networks and talk about issues that are important, kitchen table, those kitchen cabinet type things, or the walks, all of those sorts of things. You guys get that and how that works. The good news is the science backs that up really deeply as well. There's something called deep canvassing is the latest organizing trend in the US. I'm sure you guys do it all in your campaigns as well, but long, authentic, genuine conversations with people have been able to de-radicalize really deeply transphobic people to being in favor of supporting good legislation to protect trans people. That's the power of these one-on-one conversations. And related to that, as I mentioned before, is just recreating the echo chamber. So, connecting to each other when you see something online that tells our compelling story, share it with your networks and get other people to share it with their networks and spread it, and do it with that passionate intensity that others spread disinformation with.
That's fantastic, Ed. I think there's some really, really practical tips there that people on this call can take away. And when we go into our networking session later this evening, we're also going to be talking about that in more detail amongst in our groups. But one of the things that is in your amazing book as well is the power of good political leadership. So I'm hoping to cross to Zali to talk about calling out lies and the role of the community independents and the crossbench in raising debate on difficult topics in Parliament. And also, so just to sort of recognise that Zali took the very brave step of standing up twice now as an independent through 2 campaigns. You've been on the front line of fake news and fake sites and lies, and we'd love to hear about how that impacts your work and also how you and your community combat that sort of disinformation in practice.
Yes, thanks. I mean, I'd like to also just touch on some of what Ed was talking about around that tribalism and the echo chamber. It works in the reverse as well, in the positive. So just as that minority can seem very loud, so can, and I think this is the power of the community independent movement, is in fact that the strengths of that community, and it grows, you know, the positivity of people wearing the t-shirts, campaigning, looking like they're having fun, being joyful about what they're doing, that encourages others to be joyful, and that ultimately grows a tribe that's very different, a much more empowered and energized. You know, positivity does it more. If I can give you an analogy from my sporting days, there's 2 states of mind in which you can perform at your best, like at the Olympic Games or World Championships and things like that. There's a state of sort of being in a happy state of mind. So you're in a sort of aroused state from happiness. You've got adrenaline, you've got oxytocin flowing, you're feeling good and confident. And so you approach the race with an open outlook. Or the only other way of sort of winning is if you're in a state of anger. So you're at a state of heightened excitement and adrenaline through probably anger, but that is a much harder state to control, and you can't maintain that. So you might get the odd race where that works, but as a whole, it's not a viable strategy from approaching your sport psychology of how do you approach race day. So I take a lot of what I learned from sport to now campaigning and politics, because it's very, very similar. To get people to do their best, it's that if you are in a happy state, you've got adrenaline, you've got oxytocin, you've got the feel-good vibes, people are then more open, your physical approach is more engaged, you'll have better eye contact, your one-on-one conversations, you know, from your volunteers in the street will be much better and will be more positive and more convincing. So it's really interesting how it is the same psychology that applies. Politically, I mean, yeah, it's been interesting. It was one of my first shocks in 2019 of getting into politics, was understanding that we had no legislation around misleading and deceptive advertising in politics. So when we think of, you know, goods and services and advertising that we see for products and services, there are rules around what kind of advertising, and there are laws to protect consumers, well-established laws when it comes to misleading and deceptive claims around a product or a service. Now, what's amazing is that in politics, there is nothing. It's just a free-for-all. We have very minimal laws around. You can't misdirect a voter on how to vote, i.e. how to fill out a form. But beyond that, we really have no protection. So I found that quite staggering in 2019, getting into politics, coming from a legal background, thinking we're a fairly well-established democracy, and understanding that this is a free-for-all. So worked on a bill called Stop the Lies, and these are not new concepts, but around trying to put the same kind of rigor or test in terms of factual claims made in advertising that we do for goods and services in the commercial world into claims being made in the political arena as well when it comes to advertising. Now, this is legislation that's been in place in South Australia for 20 years. The ACT has now introduced it as well. And it's really important, it's absolutely doable. Of course, it does mean, like in the commercial sense, you need someone to determine to determine a dispute, and that's, you can take it back to the courts. The courts are there to determine facts. So I introduced a Stop the Lies bill in the last parliament, which the Labor, whilst in opposition, supported and really got behind. Now, of course, coalition was not so keen to go down that road, and it's got to be said that the major parties have each taken advantage of this gap at various times. 2016, you sort of had the Midi Scare campaign, 2019, the desk taxes. Each side like to use negative campaigning to scare voters about sort of the other side. And it's generally the crossbench that pushes for, I think, this trying to raise the bar of politics and trying to really change fix some of these gaps of these double standards between how politics is regulated and the rest of our business lives, and as consumers, everything else is regulated, which there's a big gap. Now, fast forward to this year, I have reintroduced the Stop the Lies bill, but I've amended it to refer to the referendum. So we know from Brexit, for example, that referendums attract a huge amount of disinformation, and that it's because the referendum centres is one question. This is not like an election where you have maybe a whole number of policy issues on which you're basing your vote. A referendum turns on generally one issue, one question. And so referendums are really prone to disinformation and are notoriously hard as a result if they're not protected from disinformation. So I felt it was incredibly important when the government announced a desire to hold the referendum this year that we put in place this legislation ahead of time to protect against disinformation in this very important national conversation that we're going to have. So I reintroduced the bill. I've reconnected with the Minister. Minister Farrell, when the government was first formed, actually announced that in principle, the Labor government supports legislation to stop misinformation in political advertising. But unfortunately, they did what the traditional parties have a tendency to do. They announced a inquiry. There is a joint standing committee inquiring into the election, and of course they put out an interim report in March that says, look, it's a question, we know it's a problem, but we won't do a determined view until the final report. The final report won't be till the end of the year and will be too late for the referendum. No. So I've got a meeting coming up with Minister Farrell, and I'm going to raise it again. It's a real problem because if you kick this issue down the road, you risk one of the most important national questions that we're going to have in terms of who we are as a country. Now, there are alternatives, so I've reintroduced that. I moved an amendment last week when we were in Parliament. We were debating the referendum amendment provisions, and I again tried to insert that there would be fact-checking in an amendment, or that there be the Stop the Lies bill as well. The government has agreed to some form of a pamphlet, yes and no pamphlet, and that's regulation that's due to come in the Senate. Now, I have moved an amendment, and I know others will in the Senate, to ensure that that pamphlet be subject to independent fact-checking, because again, you can't have this process which is to peddle disinformation. You can have people expressing opinions about whether they like an idea or not, but you certainly should not have it being disinformation. So in the political context, it's incredibly important. Things get twisted all the time. I mean, we have very topical questions at the moment with, the commitment around the submarines, $368 billion over 30 years. We want to make sure we're making those decisions on proper facts. Questions around, gas and whether we need to continue fracking. Do we have shortages or supply shortages? We don't have supply shortages. We have, I would say, reservation shortages because we export it all. So it's all how you frame issues as to what is actually a correct fact versus a misinformation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we'll go to questions in a moment, but just before we do, Ed, I know you've been doing work directly with the Voice. So is there anything you'd like to add to the issues that Zali raised around the Voice and the upcoming referendum and disinformation before we head to question time?
Yeah, it's really scary to see that the misinformation and disinformation out there are already controlling the narrative around this, and a lot of the things that that we've talked about tonight, you know, from a theoretical point of view, we can see it all happening, and so yeah, there's it would be wonderful if Zali's bill and amendment can get through in time, at least to have some more, you know, a healthier information ecosystem around this, so that it's a level playing field between both sides. There's legitimately held views on both sides. I'm very strongly in favour of a yes vote. But what's important is that it's not a level playing field between both sides when one side is filled with misinformation that's spreading and controlling the narrative and the other one isn't. And that's what these sorts of amendments are introduced to protect. Michelle, maybe this is a good time to give a little case study that about the last time we had a referendum, because it's if that's all right, Anyo, because that actually is a good example of some of the things we've talked about tonight, and also a good lesson for this one.
You got the third slide, Michelle?
So I'm sure most people on the call remember that 25 years ago or so, whenever 1991 was, 24 years, I guess.
1999 it was.
That's right, 24 years. So we didn't have social media, but that's okay. We've got some lessons in the absence of that here too. So let's look at the yes and no case and see what precepts these use here, or as I like to call it, 4 words that killed the Republic. So let's look at the yes case first. And this is taken from that official pamphlet, which was mailed to every household and outlined the case for voting yes and the case for voting no. So here we are. Here was the case for voting yes. It would not change the flag or the national anthem. It would not change a number of public holidays. It would not break tradition of stable parliamentary democracy, et cetera, et cetera. You see, you get where this is going. So all of this was framed in the negative of negating the other side's view and the other side's misinformation, that we would have to change the flag or get kicked out of the Commonwealth Games, or we wouldn't get any public holidays anymore. And so this was a really ineffective messaging for this campaign. Now let's have a look at the messaging of the no case. Here's the case for voting no. Don't know, vote no. Another thing our brains like is rhyming. I didn't have enough time to get in that level of detail.
So effective, yeah.
So effective, right? And we see this again. And this message really won the day. Where there was any doubt, where there was any confusion, where there was any apprehension to change something, this don't know, vote no really played into the way that our brains like to think and maintain the status quo. And I think we're seeing a similar case at the moment on this referendum, where people like Peter Dutton, who don't want to come out and say vote no, they know that by sowing confusion or doubt and talking about detail, this is exactly what's going to end there. So thanks, Michelle. That's just, I thought I'd just pull out a couple of very specific examples of the last time we had to have a referendum.
That's really helpful.
Can I just add, really good. Anyo, sorry. What was really interesting before the last election was we knew there was going to be misinformation thrown, and we didn't have legislated protection by having passed the bill. So what we did was set up a referral email address to which people could report misinfo, and literally was called reportmisinfo.com.au, like it was a very clear cut. And what that did, by promoting that, we got people way ahead of being exposed to misinformation or disinformation, thinking about and Ed touched on it, whether or not what they were about to hear or be exposed to was going to be true or not. And so it was like an inoculation, an insurance policy that they were preparing themselves to question the facts that were going to be put to them. And usually if something looks a bit weird, doesn't really sit right, it probably isn't right. And so because you prepared people to think that way, they were more likely to question the message that was put to them. And it was amazing how effective that was, but also how many people really engaged with the messages they received. So I think this is what's so good about this talk, is getting people to start to think about preparing people for, we don't have the laws, we're not protected against misinformation. We need to test and think about what we get told and get shown.
Absolutely, Zali, and we've got some questions that are directed at you actually that flow on from that, which is community involvement. We've got a couple of minutes, so we'll try to get through 2 or 3 questions for between you. But one of the questions is, what can we as communities do to progress the Stop the Lies bill and get this brought forward?
Write to Don Farrell and Prime Minister Albanese and tell them you want Stop the Lies legislated ASAP. They have committed to doing it, but they're kicking the can down the road. They've said for the end of the year or maybe next year, which my concern is then we get into the following year and A, too late for the referendum, but B, you're getting really close to whenever the next election is. And again, my experience with the major parties is they'd only really get around to moving on these difficult topics if they're really made to, if the community is really saying this is something we absolutely want to have changed. Now, they are on the record of saying they want to change it, so it's time to hold them to their word and get that happening. So I would encourage everyone, inundate those MP email addresses. If you have your local MPs, write to them as well. But ultimately, the minister responsible is Senator Farrell, and ultimately it's the Prime Minister is going to be calling the shots.
Fantastic. And a very similar question, maybe too similar, is when's the government going to hold media and journalists to account for spreading disinformation?
Yeah, look, just the importance of the fourth estate, that pillar of democracy, of freedom of information and the news is so important. Where are those days of journalism, of having several sources and having to fact check what you write? Nowadays, I feel like they write first, and if there's a fact checked or something problematic, they, put a tiny little correction days later that no one ever really sees, and the damage is done.
Yeah.
I strongly support a royal commission into our media ownership laws. I think it has to be broad, because we need to look at, is it still fit for purpose when you look at so much of it being online? Fake news is addressed. Deep fakes is addressed by my Stop the Lies bill, which I don't know if everyone knows. Deep fakes is when someone can take sound and video footage of a person that's available on the web, and it can be collated into a whole new video of something completely different that you never said or did. If you may have heard on the news at the moment, ChatGPT is a new AI tool that can write speeches if you give it certain prompts. It's very similar to that in terms of being able to create content that is completely fabricated, and we have no laws to protect against that or making that illegal, which is quite scary.
This is such a huge topic. We have lots of questions, but we are running out of time. So I think maybe this last question for Ed before we go to wrap up, which is, Ed, you spoke about people being hardwired to fit in, yet conspiracy theorists contend they are the ones challenging popular consensus. Can you comment?
Yeah, and a lot of their motivation is to fit in with the other contrarians. It's a bit of a contradiction. So what we've seen a real rise in conspiracy theories coinciding with the pandemic, because when things happen that create great change or confusion or don't have good explanations ready, it really drives people into conspiratorial thinking. And the other thing that drives them there is when they get cut off from their normal avenues of support, their peers, their family, their jobs. So a lot of people who maybe they, if they held contrary opinions on vaccines and lockdowns, they might lose their relationships with their friends and family. Some of them might have lost their jobs if they refuse to get vaccinated. that doesn't remove the need for them to belong. It just pushes them into these fringe groups and conspiracy-driven groups. And when those people find each other, which is incredibly easy to do online, no matter how batshit crazy your ideas are, you'll find someone else, sharing that idea. They form incredibly strong bonds. So that need to fit in, even though they're counter culture and counter society and very much in the minority opinion, they are even more expressing that need to fit in and that need to belong in their beliefs than people in mainstream society are.
Fantastic. And I think we're running out of time. I feel like we could talk about this all night. It's such a huge topic and so topical at the moment as well. And you've given everybody such a lot of things that they can actually take back into their lives and put in practice. And we really urge everybody to stay engaged. Please do as Zali said and start writing those letters. They make a huge difference and support that bill. It's so essential. And if you'd like some more detail, please think about grabbing Ed's book, Facts and Other Lies. It's full of fantastic examples and fantastic tips and tricks and how to put in practice some methods and practices to combat disinformation. Sorry if we didn't get to all of the questions, but please, as I say, stay engaged on social media with all of us and we can all continue this amazing conversation. So thank you so much, Ed and Zali, for your time. We really appreciate it. We know how busy your schedules are. So thank you for spending this time with us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Keep up the good work. Stay positive, polite, purposeful. It's always good.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks, everyone.
And now, thank you. And tonight, I think Ed and Zali are going to pop off, but we're going to stay on and hear from Tina. So I'm going to throw to Tina Jackson, who's going to wrap up the evening and remind us of these solutions that we can take into our networking sessions. Tina.
Oh, thank you so much, Anyo. What a terrific discussion, and my thanks to Ed and Zali as well. And look, before we break into the rooms, which Michelle is going to lead us into that, I just wanted to do a bit of a quick recap of some of the things that we've heard about tonight in preparation for the discussions that we're all going to have in the room. So I really hope as many people as possible can stay on. So just going over what Ed told us about, number one, tell better stories. If facts reach people first in a compelling way, then we've won half the battle. And he talks about positively telling your values. Number two, he talked a lot about inoculation, expose people to disinformation techniques and explain how it works. And Zali talked about that with her misinformation email that we had everyone preparing people for the last election. And this produces mental antibodies. And that's what this Zoom is all about as well. Number three, pre-bunk as opposed to debunking after the fact. So pre-bunk. So don't just talk your truth. Warn people about disinformation, warn them about the dangers, get to people first, because preventing disinformation is a lot easier and much more effective than addressing it after the fact. Number four, and Ed showed this really clearly in his example there at the last referendum, don't negate a disinformation and don't try to myth bust, and which is really counterintuitive, but something to really for us all to remember. And then number five, don't amplify disinformation. And usually the correct response to disinformation is to do nothing, particularly online, and to ask yourself, do people really already know about it? Is it doing harm? And will talking about it do more harm? And in Ed's book, he also has a little acronym to do when you go through when you encounter disinformation online, and it's to err, E-R-R, on the side of caution. And so that stands for evaluate, like am I seeing or posting disinformation? So R for report, to flag the disinformation to the platform, and R, respond. And he says, only if you have to. And if you do feel you have to, then do it in private, do it one-on-one, a sort of a private message or privately talking to the person, because obviously if you do it publicly, then we're amplifying the disinformation. So while we might live in the disinformation age, there's plenty that we can all do to stop disinformation in its tracks. You know, as this fantastic discussion showed tonight, and I really can't recommend Ed's book enough. I'll just give it a little plug here, Facts and Other Lies. It really, when you read that, you will be forearmed to deal with disinformation. So finally, and just again, before I hand over to Michelle, I just want to give you a quick heads up about what we have in store. Some great things. Next, we've got a Zoom on Monday, the 3rd of April, and we're going to be spotlighting the work that's happening in North Sydney and in Curtin, the democracy work that Kylie Tink and Kate Chaney are doing with their communities, including on The Voice. And we'll get to hear firsthand how this is all unfolding in real time, and there's so much happening on the ground. And then in May, I'm thrilled to say we have another treat for you. And this time, Kathy McGowan is going to lead a Zoom on networking for political action. Now, Kathy is a very good networker and she has a lot to share. So look out for that one. That one will be another one not to miss. And then coming up in June, we'll be holding the 2023 Community Independent Project Convention. And we're really thrilled to announce that Michaela is going to host the 2023 convention. And you'll recall that last year's convention was hosted by Warringah, and it was the next steps for empowered communities. And we all celebrated the election like no other. And then in 2021, we had the Getting Elected convention. And that was hosted by INDI, and that convention kicked off the Community Independence Project. So in June, we'll be hearing from the independent MPs. We'll be clocking in, and again, Kathy will be having another panel discussion with them, similar to what she had at the last convention, to talk about the last year and what's been achieved. We've got community leaders, we've got experts, we've got some terrific special guests. There'll be the expo hall, which was such a success last time, and lots of networking opportunities. Some of the feedback that we got was that it was a little bit long last time, so this time it's just the one day, just the Saturday, the 3rd of June. So we're coming now, it's 8 o'clock, to the first part of our Zoom. We do hope lots of people will stay on for the networking. So if you can't and you need to leave now, goodbye from all of us at CIP, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on the 3rd of April. So bye to those who need to go.